A completely new way of showcasing warfare, an actual great power spheres of influence system, and a trade and economy overhaul, which essentially makes this an entirely new and improved game. If you are asking yourself if you should return to or pick up Victoria 3 for the first time, this review will answer your question, but I guess I'll give you a little spoiler already now. Yes, Victoria 3 has experienced so many key upgrades since launch that ever going back to the 1.0 version is unthinkable. And yet, despite having paid DLCs, the fact that the biggest changes have arrived as free updates means that even if you don't own any DLC, you too will experience the bulk of these innovations. In other words, over the course of the 2.5 years after the game's release, Victoria 3 has truly come into its own. So if you are curious about the changes and the quality of the game, keep on watching. And listen, I love you guys and value your engagement with my videos, and if the love is returned, it would be awesome if you left a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. As for some inexplicable reason, only 3.1% of you are subscribers. And if you want to contribute even more, consider becoming a channel member too, which goes a long way in supporting the channel and my independent work. This is a review for both newcomers and veterans out there, so get comfy and let's jump into this behemoth of a strategy game. When asked what Victoria 3 really is, I find it hard to compare it to other Paradox games, but I think that's the beauty of it. In some ways it marries Europa Universalis 4 with Hearts of Iron 4, and arguably even with a dash of Imperator Rome, while at the same time very much being its own thing. You'll perhaps notice that I didn't really mention Victoria 2 here, which can seem strange, but Victoria 2 is a game from a completely different era. A game from vastly different design languages and philosophies, and for better or worse, a very different game from Victoria 3. Now, I liked Victoria 2, but found it underwhelming in comparison to Paradox's immediate and much later games, and so this is no inherent negative factor for me. But despite these comparisons, Victoria 3 is very much its own game, and more than 2 years after release has truly come into its own and solidified itself as a strong title capable of standing on its own legs, and perhaps in contrast to a few other titles in the genre these days, mostly completely without the need for DLC if you want to dive in raw. Victoria 3 takes place in the long 19th century, meaning it officially spans the years 1836 to 1936. This means that we find ourselves in a post-Napoleonic Wars world, where Great Britain is the world's strongest empire, not least of all by dominating markets around the world. But don't let that little number 1 sign fool you, because having the most prestige at the start does not guarantee you lasting glory. The 19th century is one of great powers and a rule of great powers after all, a century of major changes in the strength of some empires and the rise of others. In Europe, France remains powerful and still clings to the idea of Napoleon's legacy. Prussia, once a lesser German state, eyes not hegemony just in Germany, but a fully operational German empire. In Asia, the Ottoman Empire is in stark decline and must go up against even the elements to reassert itself, while the Chinese also have their fair share of troubles due to, let's just say they really do be handling a little too much of the good stuff. And in America, where the United States stand at the precipice of civil war, but is virtually destined to assert itself as one of the world's great powers, if not the greatest of them all. Despite everything I've just said, you can control each and every state in the game, as long as they are recognized as such. And thusly, you, to the best of your ability, may change the course of the future of any of the countries herein. This is the beauty of Victoria 3 and Paradox games in general, the sheer freedom of what's possible and open to you. Of course, not every nation is made equal in Victoria 3, as some countries, namely mostly the great powers, offer the most value at the moment. And by value, I mean unique content that makes them stand out further. This brings us to the Journal, a mission system of sorts which in Victoria 3 acts as an optional guiding tool for your campaign. The Journal offers every faction in this game various generic missions, most often related to the development of your state, in order to bring you forward and give you set goals that more often than not will be beneficial to you. For example, urbanizing your country or building railroads brings you along the path to industrialization, which is what the 19th century was all about. But for the truly fun journal entries, we must look to a set section of factions in particular, namely the Greats for the most part. Austria, a multifaceted empire in the Victorian age, must deal with several issues right off the bat. As South Germans and Habsburgs, the Austrians still see themselves as leading the Holy Roman Empire and dreams of becoming the true recognized German hegemon. As such, they must fight with Prussia, either militarily or diplomatically, to complete their journal entries to at one point hope to unify the German people. But at home, Austria is a multicultural but discriminatory empire and must decide whether to recognize the Hungarians as true citizens, thus paving the way for the formation of an Austria-Hungary. The Prussians have similar missions, although more focused on Germany itself, as Prussia is able to initially form not just the North German Federation, but Germany itself. The Ottoman Empire similarly has a range of journal entries to fulfill, most of them related to the saving of the empire in its various aspects, from rebuilding the industry to the army, reforming the political landscape of the empire to be more modernized, and to make sure the Egyptians are put in their place. On the other side of the world, the United States has entries dealing with the law of slavery and whether to keep it or ban it, which ultimately is very likely to lead to civil war, unless you manage to maneuver the landscape tightly, of course. Other states around the world share similar missions and journal entries, and I think this type of flavor adds so much to the experience. Personally, I really wish Victoria's system looked and felt more like EU4's, where we have visible mission branches all laid out with unique and beautifully drawn icons. Compared to these, I find Victoria 3's journal system lacking in visual style and finesse, but it's not a deal breaker. If you additionally own the DLCs, Voice of the People and Colossus of the South both add unique missions and deepens the experience for both France and Brazil, plus South American factions respectively. This means that France receives unique entries related to the re-emergence of the French Empire and the power struggle enabling Napoleon III. And Brazil gets to fight over the destiny of that country, of whether it should remain an empire or become a republic, and much like the US, determine the role of slavery in the country. Paradox games are not built in a day, nor in a year or 5, and Victoria 3 is certainly no different. But if I had to mention one aspect where Victoria 3 is still lacking in immersion and fun roleplay, it has to be this journal system. I do think it works as a bare minimum type of flavor, and it's certainly much better to have it than not, but compared to the mission tree system in EU4, the missions in Imperator Rome, or the focus tree in Hearts of Iron 4, the journal system is by far the weakest. I know a lot of people still want a major warfare rework, but I think for me, a true journal/mission tree rework, which implements branching paths, unique icons, and importantly, more opportunities for immersion, is what I still crave the most for Vicky 3. And if not just for the fact that mission trees are goated, I think it could mend something people also find a little jarring, namely the infamy system of Vicky 3, a feature we'll also get back to much later. You see, conquering land in Victoria 3 causes infamy, a value which makes it hard to expand, and it's there because the main purpose of Victoria 3 is economic and diplomatic gameplay, not necessarily warfare first and foremost. However, we do have examples of conquest happening in this time frame, of course, and as this is a game, it should be possible to go alternate history as well. As such, and based on EU4 mission trees, I think missions could be a fun way to allow players to expand or accomplish certain achievements without incurring the usual amount of infamy, for example. I mean, the journal system does allow for the unification of Germany and Italy without incurring massive infamy penalties after all, so why shouldn't we have similar and more expansion missions for other nations too? I mean, this is the era of the Franco-Prussian Wars and World War I after all, and a lot of stuff happened then. But journal entries are luckily not the only way Victoria 3 brings unique flavor to its countries, as both culture and even more factors play important roles here. For example, I find it extremely cool that a minor power like Norway, who even begins this game in a personal union with Sweden, and unless the player takes charge would likely never amount to much, is in fact offered a surprising amount of succulent taste. For example, the starting Norwegian army is named Hæren, meaning army in Norwegian, and is indeed how Norwegians refer to the state army. It's awesome that, like every state in this game, Norway's political scene is not just a blank slate, but it actually begins in a state that's more or less exactly aligned with how the country's internal laws looked at game start. More than that, the parties within Norway, rather than always being called something generic, are actually given the Norwegian names, and when new parties show up, they're also given their real-life names, meaning it's cool to see new parties, like the Labour Party, show up and emerge as time goes on, and as the agitation of the workers becomes stronger. Further, every country is given generic local agitators that wish to change the political landscape of your state, but that with the Voice of the People DLC, countries are also given actual historical agitators. And Norway in this example is no different. And you might hear it in my voice, but it's so much fun to see people you've learned about in school and who are often considered national legends actually show up in Victoria 3 as important characters. And lastly, unique buildings will be present depending on where you're located. And as in the case of Norway, since resources are for the most part correctly placed around the world, you're going to be seeing a lot of iron, a lot of logging camps for producing wood, a lot of ports for fish, and importantly, whaling is an important and semi-rare building available in northern Norway, meaning that even in the realm of buildings, you will find uniquely flavored distinctions as well. I mean, it took Paradox 7 years to give Norway and the Nordic countries their very own unique missions and revamps in Hearts of Iron 4. But still, even without journal entries, there is so much to love and so many unique sides to this Norwegian experience. And I believe the same goes for virtually every other major or minor power out there, to admittedly varying degrees. This is all to say that even though not all states are created equal, the baseline of being offered unique cultures, distinct and mostly historical political situations at the beginning of your campaign, historically and geographically accurate resources that shape countries, and often uniquely and language-appropriate named parties and characters go a very long way in creating a culturally deep and rich experience. Is the game exactly where I'd want it to be? No, not yet I guess. But guess what? EU4 was a great strategy game on launch. I certainly loved it back in August 2013, but it offered just a fraction of what it ended up offering a few years later. In fact, it took a long 5 years of that game being out and worked on before we got the first iteration of the unique mission tree and a proper parliament system, i.e. proper new ways of governing. And it took a long 8 years before Central Europe got a true revamp of the Holy Roman Empire system, which is such an integral part of so many important factions in that game. And mark my words, this is not to say that this should have been in the game on launch, because there's no way they could have been. Learning, improving, and developing takes time and money after all. I will say that I wish event images had more unique flavor to them though, because I do dislike seeing the exact same images for France as I do for Egypt or China. It just doesn't make much sense to have the same cities or cultures being shown, so a fairly simple fix could be to commission new artwork, but to tailor them per continent or cultural alignment or something. So European countries had the same type of event images, East Asian nations shared their images, and so on. You can probably tell how important immersion is to me, but then again, it has always been important to Paradox games to tailor the experience to who you're playing as, so I truly think I'm just asking for what Paradox has already done in previous games here. Victoria 3 is so much more than just the states you rule, of course, and the main deciding factor in how the game progresses is not really who you rule, but how you rule. So let's begin with the most exciting part of Victoria 3, since it's the one that's received one of the largest revamps in the series' history, Warfare. Back at launch, Warfare in Victoria 3 was bare bones. The stated idea from Paradox was that less focus was put on warfare and micromanaging in particular, because the main aim of Victoria 3 was internal politics, population management, and trade. Now these last three things are all well and good, but in my opinion, there is no grand strategy game, and certainly no Paradox grand strategy game, without borders moving and shifting, and doing so primarily duking it out on the battlefield. That's not to say Paradox games have never been warfare management first, unless we're talking Hearts of Iron 4, but it's always been important. Warfare in EU4, for example, is integral to that game, even though technological advancement, state management are crucial parts of that game as well. But the problem with Victoria 3 on launch wasn't just that control was taken more away from us, but also that it just didn't work well. And further, that these systems behind and results following from battles appeared nonsensical. And to top it all off, they didn't even look good, but appeared boring, static, and very hastily put together. By now, Warfare is vastly improved, and not least of all in that last department. Now, Victoria 3 sports arguably the best warfare animations in any Paradox game ever, and I will say that I think they look even more dynamic and epic than the ones in Hearts of Iron 4. Now, front lines are filled with soldiers, artillery, defensive barricades and positions, and even the beautiful flags of the participating nations. These positions will even adapt to the environment, meaning while the long and flat fronts of Western Europe might be easy enough to render, the mountains of Norway will see certain positions holding the high ground. It doesn't work perfectly though, and sometimes you'll see armies literally fighting in the ocean. Now this could have been a really cool feature, say if an enemy invaded from the sea but had to make a beach landing and do a D-Day situation, but this was not the case here. Either way, I truly find these new animations to be groundbreaking, and even though in the end it remains people shooting at each other until one side wins, so like in EU4 or Hearts of Iron, the spectacle, in addition to some extra victory and defeat animations, does indeed turn this into something of a paradigm shift for Paradox battle animations. I didn't mention Stellaris here because I find it to be quite a different experience, but that game does admittedly offer very cool animations as well. One area where even more visual improvements could have been made is in the naval department though, where yes, one more ship is present on each side, but they don't shoot very often, and we are clearly still lacking finesse and that spice here. More smoke, more natural shooting instead of one rare burst, and so on. I'd love to see better naval animations in later updates, but for now, it's at least better than what we had. Now, army management is a different beast, and even though it retains the soul of the release version, i.e. the management of armies and assigning them to front lines, I find that the way it goes about this has dramatically improved. First of all, the revamp of the UI now does a much better job of giving you a good overview over your armies, generals, and the aspects therein. Your armies are neatly vertically lined up, generals or their empty seats are front and center, and all vital information is right here, like where the unit is currently stationed, which orders your commanding generals are given, where they are mobilized, and so on. What is important to notice though, and what will be confusing to you if you don't know where to look, is the importance of number of battalions in an army versus its actual fighting strength. For example, an army with a fighting strength of 73 men is for the most part very strong, but the actual strength of that army comes from the actual men in those regiments left to fight. As you can see, the numbers of regiments after a war begins is almost always higher, sometimes much higher, than the actual number of thousands of fighting units, because when a battle occurs, the number of regiments is what's being shown, while the blue bar, signifying lives left, is what in the end actually matters. This is why you sometimes can see much larger armies lose to smaller ones, because while the larger one might have fought all the war, the smaller might be fresh, and of course might even be better trained. This leads us to everything surrounding the numbers. You see, everything in Victoria 3's warfare system relies on each other. In this case, every army is influenced by its general, which can affect their morale and offensive and defensive strength, and even special formations depending on the general, and of course the ratio of infantry to cannons to cavalry, but more than that are their mobilization options. Victoria 3 allows you to outfit your armies with various ways of being, say giving your soldiers chocolate, tobacco, or even opium to deal with the stress of the battlefield. You can even assign armies to make use of your railway systems for faster movement, or use your market resources to set up first aid stations or even field hospitals. All of these affect various aspects of your individual army's morale, recovery rate, and offensive and defensive capabilities. And while it's a bit more in the background, they are essential to pay attention to and use correctly. Of course, you need to be aware that assigning these modifiers do drain resources from your market and can be very expensive if you're short on a resource. Either way, if you find yourself losing battle after battle, it might just be because you're not using your mobilization options correctly. It's a deep and great system that only becomes more fun to use and fiddle with time, as you unlock more technologies and expand your market to accommodate new options. You can even easily see which modifiers your enemy army is using, meaning it's quite transparent actually, and can tell why you might be having a hard time battling a seemingly superior foe. Of course, a major part of warfare is sound strategic and tactical thinking, and there are more ways than one to topple an enemy empire. Victoria 3's warfare system is based on front lines for armies and sea nodes for navies, and moving them about is as easy as ever. We can station units in friendly territories, deploy them to fronts, plan naval invasions by combining the army with the navy, and transfer units between armies. It's fairly simple to grasp, and the UI does a good job now of making it simple to work with as well. What's even better is that armies and their movements are now visibly represented by each army signifier moving on the map, and with the pathways they'll be taking to their location. It's even possible to see their 3D models move around now as well, which is a massive step up from the non-existent models on launch. One of the biggest improvements to Warfare is that every frontline can now experience several battles at once, and each battle will often feature relatively large portions of your armies. In addition, while the abilities of your generals, offensive and defensive capabilities, and other modifiers will matter a whole lot for the outcome of any battle, I find that the number of soldiers now matter a lot more than they used to, meaning that the results of battle will often be more in line with expectations. Not always though, because it does admittedly feel strange and confusing to not know why one army's offensive capability is so much lower than an opposing army's defensive ones, because it's not immediately clear in the UI. But actually, it's largely up to your ratio of infantry to cannons to cavalry, And while infantry gives you much more defensive capabilities, cannons give you much more offensive ones. Since this is so clear in EU4 for example, where we instantly can find out a general's stats, plus if either army has negative or positive modifiers from terrain, I really feel that Victoria 3 needs to adopt a similar, clear approach. Another problem arises when there are several allied nations on the same front, and when other generals than your own begin the fighting. First of all, it's rather hard to find out which armies will make it to those battles, and it can be especially weird if a general from a smaller and weaker nation seems to be fighting all the frontline battles when you, the larger and mightier army, should be the one leading the charge. A few major issues warfare in Victoria 3 has had in the past has been front splitting, naval invasions not fully working, and things like retreating armies from a lost front moving through enemy territory to get back to friendly armies, rather than simply being cut off or stack wiped. Luckily, most of these glaring issues are gone. Front splitting in particular has been severely mended and is now a rare thing in the same theater. Naval invasions absolutely do work, but I do believe the retreating armies thing is still a bit of an eyesore. I can't fully say for sure if it's gotten better with the last patches, but that has at least been an issue in the past. However, the fact that most of the biggest issues are fixed is great to finally see, but what's more is that we have received a major update to invasions, namely land invasions through aligned neighbors. By this I mean that you can now, through the revolutionary new treaty system which we'll talk about more later, can gain military access through a third party, and then invade a country through a non-aligned country. This is so cool, and while it mimics the ability to pass through countries in EU4 for example, it really gives the strategy part of warfare a new dimension. The same goes for new army actions like strategic objectives, where you can direct armies to focus on moving forward towards certain regions, rather than a general straightforward push. If Victoria 3 was able to give me more immediate information on why I'm losing or winning a battle, a la EU4, it would be great, because now it's still not as clear as I'd like it to be. But overall, Victoria 3's warfare, and this might sound strange to some, but it's one of my favorite warfare systems in any Paradox game, because it really feels so large scale and strategic, rather than the localized, small scale and almost cartoon-like micromanaging of single soldier armies moving about the map. I love the concept of it so much, which does weigh up for some of the downsides, but I don't think we're too far away from an optimal version of the system. And if we ever get a complete warfare overhaul, I do hope the main concept remains, but that we get perhaps a bit more granularity and better presentation of information. Another important theater of war are the naval battles and the accompanying naval invasions. And while it is great and crucial, might I add, that Victoria 3 indeed does feature naval battles and gameplay, as opposed to say Crusader Kings 3, damn it, they haven't always been optimal. Much like armies, navies can be stationed in naval nodes, meaning important centers of the ocean where navies travel through and from where naval invasions are launched. Interestingly though, a naval battle will not commence even when two enemy fleets are stationed in the same node, as long as they're just moving about. If they stay in the same node however, or if a naval invasion is attempted and two fleets meet in that node, a battle will then commence. From there, they pretty much follow the same structure as field battles, where parts of yours and the enemy navy duke it out in consecutive battles. As far as this battle design goes, it works well enough, but issues have arisen when a naval invasion is involved. Sometimes it'll take forever, with no real reason specified for the wait. Other times they've just bugged out and never commenced, and a few times, although this is a rare bug for me, a naval invasion has failed, but neither the army nor the navy have been returned under my control. These have been issues in the past, but in my experience, they are nowhere near as big as they used to be, and for the most part, naval invasions work as intended. I do hope we get a bit more flair to naval battles in the future, but overall, the concept is there. And right now, it works, which when combined with land warfare and naval invasions, feels amazing to pull off. In the past, the AI has had major issues with properly utilizing its navy. For example, an easy way to defeat Great Britain has in fact been to sneak an army onto the home islands through a naval invasion, which should be extremely difficult when considering that the wooden wall is an English classic. I do experience the AI being a lot better with utilizing its navies these days though, so actually fielding a navy that can hold its own is now crucial, because the AI's navy will attempt to track you down and stop you from invading willy-nilly. When it comes to actually winning wars, Victoria 3 does some exceptionally awesome things, but also makes a few bad choices. Getting to the good parts first, I truly find it revolutionary that it's possible for both sides of a conflict to give concessions and experience victories. In an extremely exciting Ottoman-Egyptian war, where I as France graciously decided to help Egypt on the conditions that if we both won the war, I would become the new overlord over the Ottoman subject of Tripolitania. And what happened was that all sides got bogged down in Egypt. Despite gains in Anatolia and now ending up with the initiative, the Egyptians had lost so many men that they were tired of war. And then, an agreement was made that would benefit all parties in some way. While the Ottomans would get their initial war claim of Konya, the Egyptians would get a treaty port returned to them, and I would indeed get Tripolitania as my subject. In other words, somehow, Victoria 3 has now by far the best system for peace negotiations, offering not just a zero-sum or white peace option, but an actual possibility of mutually beneficial peace agreements. It might not sound like all that if you're new to the series, but to someone like me, who's used to the one-sided victories of other Paradox games, and frankly, any strategy game, this new system appears revolutionary. As alluded to, Victoria 3 allows other nations, no matter whether they're your allies or not, to join an ongoing diplomatic play in its second phase, i.e. the diplomatic lead-up to war. And now, not only can the war initiator tempt potential partners with a wide variety of war spoils should they win, but every involved nation can offer to join either side of the war in return for the same spoils. Not only is this awesome, since it actually gives so much more room for opportunism, but the AI is really good at making the most of it, both as war leaders and as potential allies in your own wars. I'm really enjoying these systems and find that they bring so much more depth to diplomacy in the crucial aspect of war. In other words, Victoria 3's warfare system is leagues better than they were on launch. I actually love it now, and I'm genuinely excited for my next war, and I dare say that they can now feel even better than wars in other Paradox games. They still need to iron out some strange bugs and design choices, and to implement clear information on why things are turning out the way they are. But for the most part, Warfare is now a fun and enjoyable experience in terms of execution, but could still use more granular mechanics and perhaps even localized front events for more immersion. Of course, leading up to war is always diplomacy, and Victoria 3 has completely revamped its approach to diplomacy twice over. First by implementing the signature diplomatic play system, by implementing diplomatic treaties, which expands and elevates diplomacy to completely new heights. This is because it's now possible to negotiate bilateral treaties on any number of topics or issues, as no other historical Paradox GSG has done before. In essence, this is a true negotiation system where things are offered or traded, and because Victoria 3 is such a deep game, you can negotiate anything from the exchange of goods to cash transfers, give or demand states, demand monopoly rights over goods in foreign countries, law changes, investment rights and trade privileges, alliances, duration, and more. You can even name these treaties for added immersion, and overall it's a fantastic diplomacy system that elevates the feeling of agency. Apart from this peacetime system, we have Victoria 3's classic diplomatic actions, demands, and plays, which as a rule are unilateral moves. These happen from the diplomatic lens, where you can improve or damage relations, embargo countries, invite to power blocks, demand investment rights, or indeed conquer states. In other words, when you want to diplomatically engage with a foreign country, the treaty system is usually where to go. If you wish to influence or demand something from a foreign country that might result in war, then the diplomatic actions and demands is the place to be. And indeed, diplomatic demands is where we get to our third stage of diplomacy, or rather, where it ends, the diplomatic place. Because if we want to do something more, let's say puppeting a foreign nation or demand territory, well, unless your target backs down immediately, which they rarely do by the way, we begin what's known as a diplomatic play. Diplomatic plays is a centerpiece of Victoria 3, because this is where shit goes down. Before a war has started, both parties go through a diplomatic play of 3 phases: deciding on claims, grabbing partners to your side, and then mobilizing your troops. The first and the latter can be done at any point, but only during this middle phase can other factions opt in to join in the war on either side. As one of Victoria 3's cornerstones, a lot is riding on this system, and it definitely is cool in many ways. It's genuinely great that we can draw and be drawn into wars by other factions, and what's more is that wars do not have to happen either. In fact, depending on the strength of the opposing alliance, both you and your opponent may at any point choose to back down and let either nation win their primary war goal before even a shot is fired. The existence of a primary war goal necessitates the existence of secondary war goals, naturally. And the war goals are an important part of any diplomatic play, not just because it determines what can be gained, but because in Victoria 3, you actually don't gain infamy by taking your war goals after a won war, but simply by the act of demanding them. It's how you can end up biting over more than you can chew even before a war has begun. You see, in Victoria 3, infamy determines how much of a menace you are, how willing you are to expand your nation's borders and trample over other states. If your infamy level rises high enough, other nations will like you less, are more likely to band together against you, and can even attack you with a special war goal called cut down to size, which means that if completed, the defending nation will have to release all subjects and provinces gained through conquest in the past 10 years. This can be devastating, especially since if you're already at a stage where one great power targets you with cut down to size, other great powers are very likely to join in, which is definitely not a nice feeling at all, and can totally sabotage a campaign unless you have the army and navy to back up your expansionist ways. Diplomatic plays then is overall a very cool way of structuring wars and demands, especially in an era that's more and more interconnected and more dominated by great powers. But it's not perfect. For example, it can be frustrating when you're playing as a minor power like Norway and trying to make a diplomatic move like, say, conquer Denmark. When I targeted the Danish capital with a conquer claim, the freaking USA came to Danish aid, siding with them in the war despite not having an alliance or defensive pact. This obviously made it impossible for me to do anything, and I found it quite unrealistic that the US, probably quite unwilling in the middle of the 19th century to fight in a minor overseas European war, would join in here. I retried, of course, now targeting Iceland instead of the Danish capital region. And lo and behold, the US didn't care this time, probably since those regions were less important in infamy levels. In other words, it is sometimes possible to circumvent the ire of the great powers, but still, this sort of intervention happens quite a lot, I'd say, much more than is actually fun. And if I think Paradox could do something to make Victoria 3 a bit more flexible and maneuverable, it would be to raise the threshold for when great powers actually decide to join diplomatic plays like this, especially when there were no immediate massive benefits for them doing so. I do think it's an interesting choice, however, to allow anyone with a strategic interest in a region to potentially join a conflict in said region. I just think that threshold for when the AI decides to join needs to be tweaked, since after all, putting dozens if not hundreds of thousands of men on the line and possibly your own strategic defense is a big risk. It's also a fact these days that a country like Britain feels extremely aggressive, while other major powers do feel a bit less eager to stop the GB from maintaining its hegemony, so it might be tougher than usual to be a minor country now, especially if you're playing away from Europe. But that's also realistic, of course, so do with that as you will. So far, I haven't really touched on Victoria 3's lens system, which is for all intents and purposes the main shortcut to most of the game's actions. Here you can not only choose between diplomatic actions, but also pick buildings to construct or decrees to proclaim, and this leads us to Victoria 3's arguably most important aspect, the economy and the market, which have received massive overhauls since launch. You see, despite wars and diplomacy being important, every country in Victoria 3 is dependent on every building, every resource, and every citizen, meaning it's a multifaceted system that is ever-changing and evolving. Every building has a specific purpose, and do not just create one or more resources depending on which sector it belongs to, but create jobs and wealth for your pops, and tax revenue for the state. Virtually every building demands input resources to create new goods and manufacture their own, sometimes goods that are end products themselves, but mostly resources that are used in other factories. What's most important here is that the success of each building depends on the price of goods coming in and the price of goods going out, which in the end determines the surplus and profitability of the building sector. While it is possible to subsidize sectors depending on your economic laws, it should always be a primary goal to have most buildings be profitable, which in turn allows them to pay good taxes and hire new workers, which again raises the standard of living in your empire. But it doesn't end there. Each building has different production methods, meaning there are even more ways of managing them. Production methods govern how resources are made, from which material, how they're brought to market, and who owns the factories, meaning a lot is at play here. Frankly, it's an amazing system, especially when you consider how you can determine production methods per region. All of this is further deepened by your technology, which influences the availability of your methods, and your laws, which determine things like who can take control of the factories, which sectors can be subsidized, and how free your market is, i.e. how much of your construction sector is allocated to the private sector, and how much command you have over the economy, and goods coming in and out. This brings us to the market, which is where all your resources circulate and become available. Every country is part of a market, but some countries are market leaders and some are market members. This can happen in several ways. A country can be a part of a larger nation's customs union, or they can be any type of subject to the overlord, also incorporating them into their market. Everything built within a market circulates there and determines the pricing of goods within that market. Goods can then be imported or exported from and to that market, thus interacting with other markets. It is admittedly a big system that might take you some time to learn, but which is very satisfying once you get the hang of it. Thing is, the system has been completely overhauled since launch by way of automation and with a new way of importing and exporting goods. Whereas before, where you would micromanage every single trade good and conduct trade agreements with import deals for single goods at a time, now, localized trade centers in your empire manage trade completely on their own as far as their capacity allows them. You can then supplement exports, imports, and investments with the treaty system. In other words, the new way of handling trade is both more immersive, more automated, and yet more fun at the same time, because it actually feels like a true market now, while keeping the government actions of specialized import or export treaties present. This system alone makes Victoria 3 so insanely much better than it was before, and is arguably the #1 reason to return if you haven't played in a while. But it doesn't stop there, because we now also have a system of spheres of influence and power blocks, which is a step up from simply being a market leader. A power block is essentially a customs union led by a great power, but one with a lot more bonuses. Because not only do you get the benefits of having a multinational market, but depending on your block's cohesion and strength, you get to introduce laws or features inherent to the block, depending on what kind of block you wish to lead. Some focus on dominating its members to one day being able to subjugate them, others focus on collective defense, and others still are for ideological or purely trade reasons, or indeed a mix. In this way, the market becomes even more intricate and interesting because power blocks is a way for the great powers to tie the world together under its diplomatic and economic power, without the need to militarily expand in order to get access to new markets or resources. It is a great system, and works even better with the new treaty system because you can now more coherently establish power block embassies and gain investment rights in order to gain leverage over that nation, in order to one day ask them to join the block. Remember that investment rights is key here, because in order to gain leverage, you're going to want to build and invest into the country you wish to invite, because investments makes them rely on you. It can be a bit tricky to figure this out on your own, but at least now you know. Power blocks then is a great way to become even more powerful than you already are, and is a core aspect of Victoria 3, which makes it even weirder to think about that it wasn't present to begin with. We also mustn't forget that even though it's often up to you to build and develop your states with new buildings and factories where needed, this is now so reliant on your laws, because while a communist command economy will give you complete reins of the state, a laissez-faire system is the opposite, giving most of your construction power away to the capitalists, meaning that even the building of your nation can be largely automated. Similarly, your economy can be isolated like Japan's, where you essentially have no external trade whatsoever, or you can practice free trade, meaning that you have very little control over export or import tariffs or subsidies, but gives you better trade advantages on the market. There's just so much choice now that wasn't present here at launch, and the game is just so much better for it. Even though we're not really spending bureaucracy points on trade agreements anymore then, we can't forget about the game's government resource systems. Bureaucracy, authority, and influence points all govern various parts of your state and your ability to make effective changes within these domains. For example, bureaucracy, coming primarily from administration centers in your state, allows you to tax your population and maintain important government institutions. Authority allows you to enact laws faster, while also order decrees to make various aspects of regions better. Finally, influence lets you actually make diplomatic agreements, and it also raises the rate at which infamy decreases. It should be mentioned that none of these have true hard caps. It's all a soft cap from when a mechanic turns positive or negative, which really begins above and below the number 0. I tend to enjoy the use of point systems like these in Paradox games, particularly because I feel like they work organically alongside the ways to make those numbers go up and down. It feels natural that building administration centers, for example, increases your power to tax the population and maintain government services or institutions, i.e., keep the bureaucracy running. This leads us to the government side of things, because every nation is made up of a head of state, a government with interest groups, and laws and institutions. The interest groups in your country and your starting laws will vary from nation to nation and are based on the historical position of each country. Interest groups can be harder or easier to change or maintain depending, as is the case in the Ottoman Empire, where the old aristocracy is majorly powerful and keeps you from evolving, which also makes it harder to enact laws you need to make reforms. I think it's a great system, honestly, since it constantly keeps you thinking about how restricted nations can be because of their internal political makeup, while overcoming major obstacles feel like massive wins in their own right. This also ties into the population system, of course, which frankly influences every aspect of the game. Pops belong to interest groups, which again have a say in how powerful they are, and pops also work in industries and buy and need goods, meaning the prices in your market do not only determine what they can afford, but the overall standard of living, and therefore which interest groups they see themselves belonging to. As such, pops can move between interest groups as they become richer or poorer, and laws in your country will in turn also affect their literacy level, meaning which jobs they are able to take. These are vastly complicated systems, but relatively easy to approach since it really doesn't demand that you know too much about it from the get-go, at least if you're not going to be making pro-gamer moves. Do be wary though, because factories need workers to produce anything, and if your country is tiny in a small market, you might find yourself without manpower or a big enough workforce to expand. As you can probably tell by now, Victoria 3 is an absolute behemoth of a game. There are so many systems here, so many facets, so many features that make up this beautiful expansive game that it's hard to put it all together in a coherent review, but I've absolutely tried my best. Like any Paradox game, Victoria 3 has come a long way since its early beginnings. I was always of the mind that Victoria 3 had fun foundations taking place in an interesting time period, but it did have major lags in particular in relation to information dissemination, warfare clarity, and trade actually working as intended. Now though, it truly feels like Victoria 3 as a package not only works, but has managed to carve out its own unique section of the Paradox universe that feels solid and on good ground, especially with the likes of power blocks, warfare improvements, automated trade, and the new treaty system. And I personally love that Victoria 3 is such a paradigm shift away from Victoria 2, rather than being what Crusader Kings 3 wants to Crusader Kings 2. I also appreciate the game's DLC approach, as the devs have prioritized putting integral systems up for free in main updates, while adding fun and immersive aspects into paid DLC. I hope this ensures that new players are able to join the game at whatever point and experience the main mechanics both now and in the future. I also want to add that the game's music is mostly fantastic, but I do wish we had more warfare-centric tracks here, because as of right now, there's literally none, perhaps with the exception of one track focused on warfare. This means that you'll hum and love your peace times, but never feel those epic moments you get in say EU4 or Hearts of Iron. In other words, Victoria 3 has never been better, and the game's future looks bright. If we could only get actual mission trees instead of the journal system, and just a few more tweaks to warfare, I honestly could not ask for much more in terms of basic game mechanics, but I'm excited for what the game has in store in the future. Let me know your thoughts on Victoria 3 and this review in the comments, and make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video. It really goes a long way. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!